The morning started quietly at Windsor Castle, the way most mornings did when the cameras were not rolling and the world was not watching. A soft gray light pressed against the tall windows, and the staff moved through the corridors in near silence, the way they had been trained to do. But on this particular morning, there was something different in the air. A stillness that felt less like calm and more like the moment before a storm decides to announce itself. Princess Charlotte had not been seen since the evening before last. That was the fact that nobody wanted to say out loud, but that everyone in the household already knew. Her personal protection officer had filed an internal report at 6 in the morning, noting that the princess had not returned to her rooms after a private dinner engagement and that her whereabouts were, as the report carefully phrased it, currently unconfirmed. That was the language they used inside those walls when they wanted to say something alarming without actually saying it. The household staff knew better than to speak about such things with any directness. A footman who had been stationed near the east corridor the previous night had told one of the senior maids that he had seen the princess leave through a side entrance just after 9 in the evening. She had been dressed simply, no jewelry, no formal coat, and she had not taken her usual security detail with her. He had assumed at the time that this was one of those informal departures that members of the family occasionally made, the kind that were quietly managed and not discussed. He had not thought much of it until the next morning, when the atmosphere in the castle changed. By mid-morning, King Charles had been briefed. He sat in his private study with 2 of his most senior advisors and listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual enough that both advisors took note of it. His expression revealed very little, which was something he had spent a lifetime perfecting. But those who knew him well could see the tension in the set of his jaw and the way his hands rested too carefully on the arms of his chair, as though he was making a deliberate effort not to move them. When his advisors finished speaking, he asked 2 questions. The first was whether the Princess of Wales had been informed. The second was whether there was any indication of where Charlotte might have gone. The answer to the first question was yes, though the conversation with Catherine had been brief and conducted with the utmost care. The answer to the second question was that they were working on it. Queen Camilla learned about her stepdaughter's disappearance from a different source entirely. Her personal secretary, a woman who had served in her household for 11 years and who had learned when to bring news quickly and when to soften it first, came to her rooms just before 11 and informed her in the kind of low, measured tone that made everything sound slightly less catastrophic than it actually was. Camilla listened with the composed attention that decades of royal life had taught her, asked several precise questions, and then sat quietly for a moment before she said anything further. What she said was that she wanted Thomas to be brought to the castle. Thomas was her son from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles. His full name was Thomas Henry Charles Parker Bowles, and he had lived his adult life at a slight but comfortable distance from the royal spotlight, carving out a career in food writing and media that had made him genuinely well known in his own right. He had always been something of a favorite among those members of the public who followed the royal family with mild rather than obsessive interest. The kind of person who seemed to humanize the institution simply by being in proximity to it. He was charming in interviews, warm at public appearances, and known for having a good relationship with both his mother and his stepfather, which in the complicated landscape of blended royal families was considered something of an achievement. But Thomas Parker Bowles also had a title. He held the style of His Royal Highness through his mother's position as Queen Consort, and this was something that had been granted with the kind of formal, carefully worded language that institutions use when they want to make something feel inevitable. The title had come with obligations, and Thomas had, by all public accounts, taken those obligations seriously. He attended the events he was asked to attend, made the statements he was asked to make, and navigated the delicate business of being both a private person and a public figure with what most observers considered considerable grace, what nobody outside a very small circle knew was that Thomas Parker Bowles had also been one of the last people to see Princess Charlotte before she disappeared. This was not information that had made it into any official report. It was information that existed, for the moment, only in the memory of the footman who had noticed that the car that arrived at the east entrance to collect Charlotte on the evening she vanished had been one that he recognized. He had seen it before in the castle's guest parking area. On occasions when Thomas Parker Bowles had visited, the footman had told only one person this detail, and that person had told only one other person. And by the time the information reached the ears of the senior members of the household security team, It had been wrapped in enough uncertainty and qualification that it had not yet been treated as significant. But it was there, moving quietly through the corridors of the castle alongside the whirring and the whispered conversations, waiting to become important. By the time Thomas arrived at Windsor in the early afternoon, having driven down from London with no particular sense that anything was wrong, the atmosphere had already shifted in ways that he could feel but not yet name. He was greeted at the door by one of his mother's senior staff members rather than by any of the usual footmen, which struck him as slightly unusual. He was told that his mother was waiting for him in her private sitting room, which was not itself unusual. But the way it was said had a quality to it that made him pause for just a moment on the threshold before he went inside. Camilla was standing when he entered, which was not her typical posture when receiving family in her private rooms. She usually sat, and there was usually tea. And the conversations, even when they were about difficult things, had a comfortable domestic texture to them that made everything feel manageable. Standing meant something different. Standing meant that what she was about to say needed the full upright weight of a serious person saying a serious thing. She told him what she knew, which at that point was limited, but alarming. Charlotte was missing. It had been nearly 48 hours. The household was keeping this contained for now, but it would not remain contained indefinitely. And then she asked him, with a directness that he had always admired in her, and that now made his heart move faster in his chest, whether there was anything he needed to tell her. Thomas Parker Bowles was not, by any measure, a man who frightened easily. He had the kind of relaxed confidence that comes from growing up in interesting circumstances and choosing to find those circumstances interesting rather than overwhelming. But in the pause that followed his mother's question, in the space between one breath and the next, something in his expression shifted in a way that Camilla, who had known him for his entire life, noticed immediately. What he said in response to her question, and what he did not say, would become the thing that changed everything. Because in the hours that followed, the household security team would receive a piece of information from an external source that would turn a private family concern into something considerably larger. And the implications of that information would move very quickly from the quiet world of internal palace management into a decision so significant, so unprecedented in its swiftness, that even those who spent their lives studying the protocols and traditions of the British monarchy would find themselves struggling to account for what happened next. The Royal Guard does not act quickly. The institutional gravity of its functions is such that decisions are made slowly, with consultation, with the kind of careful weighing of precedent and consequence that turns even urgent matters into extended deliberations. But there are moments, rare and specific and carrying with them a particular kind of weight, when the apparatus of royal protection concludes that speed is not just advisable, but necessary. This was beginning to look like one of those moments. The information that changed everything came not from inside the castle walls, but from outside them. From a source that the household security team had been cultivating for some time, without expecting it to produce anything quite as significant as what it now delivered. It arrived in the form of a message that was passed through 3 separate intermediaries before reaching the head of the Royal Guard's domestic intelligence unit, a man named Gerald Hollings, who had spent 31 years in royal protection and who was known, among those who worked with him, for a kind of methodical calm that very little could disturb. What he read in that message disturbed him considerably. The message contained details about the evening of Charlotte's disappearance. Details that were specific enough to be credible and alarming enough to require immediate escalation. It described a private gathering that had taken place at a property in West London, a townhouse that belonged to a network of individuals who had come to the attention of various security services over the preceding 2 years for reasons that fell into the category of matters that were investigated carefully and spoken about rarely. Charlotte had been at this gathering, and so had Thomas Parker Bowles. Gerald Hollings read the message twice, then a third time, then set it down on his desk and looked at the window for approximately 30 seconds. In those 30 seconds, he was doing what he had spent 31 years training himself to do, which was to move quickly through the implications of a piece of information before acting on it, to trace the paths it opened and the paths it closed, to understand not just what it meant, but what it meant that it had reached him in this particular way at this particular moment. The message told him where Charlotte had been. It told him that she was not, as far as the source was aware, in any immediate physical danger. and it told him something about Thomas Parker Bowles that would require him to make a call he had never expected to make. He picked up his phone and called the person he needed to call, which was not Queen Camilla and was not the king's private secretary, but was instead a man whose official title was Keeper of the Royal Household Security Protocols, a position that existed largely outside the awareness of the general public, but whose function was precisely suited to this kind of moment. His name was Sir Edmund Voss, and he had held this position for 9 years. And he answered Gerald Hollings's call on the second ring, because that was the kind of man he was. The conversation between Gerald Hollings and Sir Edmund Voss lasted 14 minutes. At the end of it, Sir Edmund Voss said that he needed to consult with the king before any formal action was taken. Gerald Hollings agreed that this was correct. They also agreed that this consultation needed to happen within the next several hours, before the situation had any opportunity to develop further in ways that would complicate the decisions that needed to be made. King Charles received Sir Edmund Voss in his private study for the second time that day, and this meeting had a very different quality to it than the first. The king listened with the same careful stillness he had shown before, but as the information was laid out before him, a different kind of attention came into his face. The kind that means a person has understood not just the facts being presented, but the full shape of what those facts imply. He asked several questions, each of them precise and direct. The kind of questions that a man asks when he already understands most of the situation and is checking the remaining points before he commits to a course of action. The final question he asked was the simplest and also the most consequential. He asked what the Royal Guard recommended. Sir Edmund Voss had been expecting this question, had in fact been preparing his answer to it throughout the drive from Hollings's office to the castle, and what he said was measured and careful and carried with it the full weight of institutional authority. He recommended that Thomas Parker Bowles's title be reviewed immediately, that access to crown properties and royal events be suspended pending investigation, and that a formal security inquiry be opened. He also noted, with the particular kind of careful phrasing that such moments require, that the decision about the title was ultimately the king's to make, and that it could be made as quietly or as publicly as the king saw fit. What he did not say, but what both he and the king understood, was that making it quietly was no longer really an option, because there was another piece of information that had not yet been shared with the family, one that Hollings had included in his briefing, but that Sir Edmund had chosen to leave to the end of his summary. There was a journalist, not someone who had been given information deliberately, but someone who had been in the vicinity of the West London townhouse on the evening in question, and who had taken photographs that were, as yet, in that journalist's possession and not in anyone else's. That situation had a clock attached to it, and the clock was running. Charlotte was found the following morning. She was safe, entirely unharmed, and she was found by her own personal protection officer, who had been working through the night following the leads that Hollings's team had developed. She was at a different address from the West London property, a house in Berkshire belonging to a friend who was entirely unconnected to the gathering that had caused so much alarm. Charlotte had left the gathering early, had been driven to her friend's house, and had, in the way that young people sometimes do, simply not thought to communicate her whereabouts to the people who needed to know them. She was mortified in the way that a person is mortified when they realize that their private choices have produced consequences that extend far beyond anything they anticipated. The relief that spread through the castle at the news of Charlotte being found was genuine and immediate, but it did not dissolve the situation that had developed in the hours preceding it, because the question of Thomas Parker Bowles and what he had been doing at that gathering, and what his connection to the individuals who had attracted the attention of the security services actually consisted of, was not answered by the news that Charlotte was safe. If anything, Charlotte's safety clarified the picture by removing the most urgent concern and leaving the other concerns more distinctly visible. Thomas was still at Windsor when the news of Charlotte's discovery reached the household. He had spent the night in one of the guest rooms at his mother's request, and he had been, by his own account and the account of those who had spoken with him, cooperative and forthcoming, and seemingly unaware of the full gravity of what had been put into motion. He came down to breakfast looking tired in the way that people look tired when they have spent a night in unfamiliar surroundings with a great deal on their minds. And he ate toast and drank tea and answered the questions that were put to him with the careful but genuine engagement of someone who understood that honesty was his best available option, but the questions that were put to him in the castle that morning were not the same questions that were being assembled in Gerald Hollings's office. Those questions were more specific, more technically precise, and they had attached to them a set of implications that the gentle breakfast conversation in the castle did not carry. Hollings's team had spent the night building a picture, and the picture had pieces in it that Thomas Parker Bowles could not simply explain away over toast. However honestly he tried, Camilla knew, by mid-morning, that something significant was going to happen. She had lived too long in the orbit of institutional power not to recognize the particular quality of silence that descends when a decision has been made at a level above the one she had access to. Her senior staff moved with a slightly heightened precision, a quality of alertness that they could not entirely conceal from her. And 2 of her regular daily briefings were postponed with explanations that were correct but slightly too smooth. The kind of explanations that are prepared rather than spontaneous. She called her private secretary into her rooms and asked directly what was happening. What her private secretary told her was not everything. It was not possible, at that moment, to tell her everything because some of what was happening was still happening in rooms she did not have access to and in conversations she was not part of. But what her secretary told her was enough for Camilla to understand that the situation involving Thomas had moved beyond her ability to manage it privately. And that understanding settled over her with a weight that she bore with the same composure she had spent decades developing. The composure that was not the absence of feeling, but its most disciplined form. She asked to speak with the king that afternoon. The request was granted with unusual speed, which told her something about the moment she was in and the decisions that were already being made. The meeting between King Charles and Queen Camilla took place in the king's private study, and it lasted for just over an hour. No advisors were present. No secretaries sat in the outer room to take notes or offer summaries. The door was closed, and the household staff gave the corridor a wider berth than usual, understanding from the particular quality of the day that this was not a moment for proximity. Whatever was said in that room was said only between those 2 people, and it would remain between them in the way that the most consequential conversations always do, living in the space between what is recorded and what is known. What came out of that meeting, in practical terms, was a decision. The king informed his private secretary that evening that a formal recommendation had been prepared by the household security leadership, and that after careful consideration, he had determined it was appropriate to act on that recommendation. The recommendation concerned the title held by Thomas Parker Bowles, and the determination was that it would be suspended, effective immediately, pending the outcome of a formal security review. The language used was precise and institutional, the kind of language that has been developed over generations to describe unprecedented things in ways that make them sound managed and deliberate rather than alarming. Thomas was informed the following morning. He was still at Windsor, still in the guest room where he had spent an uncomfortable and largely sleepless night. And the person who came to tell him was not his mother, which had been the original intention, but instead Sir Edmund Voss, who had been judged to be the appropriate figure for this particular communication. Sir Edmund arrived at the guest room at 8 in the morning and knocked twice and waited. And when Thomas opened the door in yesterday's clothes with the particular look of someone who had been awake for most of the night expecting bad news, Sir Edmund was as direct and as kind as the situation allowed him to be. He explained what had been decided, and why, and what the formal process would involve going forward. He told Thomas that the decision was not a punishment, but a procedural necessity, that the review would be conducted fairly and with all appropriate care, and that the outcome was not predetermined. He said all of this in a tone that was respectful and steady, and Thomas listened in the way that people listen when they are hearing something that confirms what they already feared. He did not protest or argue. He asked 2 questions, both of them practical, and then he asked if he could see his mother. Sir Edmund told him that Queen Camilla was available to see him whenever he wished. Camilla was in her sitting room, and she stood when Thomas came in, and for a moment the 2 of them simply looked at each other across the distance of the room. The way that people look at each other when words have not yet arrived to organize the feeling between them. Then she crossed the room, and they embraced. And she held him with a firmness that communicated more than anything she could have said, which was that whatever was happening and whatever would happen, she was his mother first and the queen consort second. And that order would not change. What she told him, when they sat and the tea was brought, and the initial intensity of the moment had settled into something more habitual, was that she was sorry. Not sorry in the way that people apologize for a wrong they have committed, but sorry in the way that a parent is sorry when the world does something to their child that they could not prevent. She was also, in the careful but honest way that had always characterized their relationship, direct about what she needed from him. She needed to know everything. Not the version of events that he had already shared with the household. Not the careful account that had been offered to the security team, but the full and unedited version, including the parts that were most difficult to explain. Thomas told her. He talked for a long time, and Camilla listened without interrupting, which required considerable discipline from a woman who was not by nature a passive listener. What he described was not, in its essential details, as alarming as the worst possibilities that had been assembling in the back of her mind. There had been no conspiracy, no deliberate involvement with people he understood to be a security risk, no action taken with any awareness of the implications it carried. What there had been was a series of choices made in the comfortable belief that his private life remained genuinely private. A belief that the events of the last 48 hours had dismantled with considerable thoroughness. The gathering at the West London townhouse had been attended, in Thomas's account, in the spirit of a social evening among people he knew through overlapping networks of friends and professional connections. He had not known, or not known clearly, the full extent of the security concerns that attached to some of the other guests. He had not brought Charlotte there deliberately, or invited her. She had arrived through her own connections, which overlapped with his in the way that the connections of people who move in similar social orbits tend to overlap. When he had seen her there, he had not been alarmed, because nothing about the evening had struck him as alarming. It had struck him as a pleasant dinner party in a pleasant house attended by interesting and occasionally notable people. The problem, as Camilla understood it, and as the security team had concluded in the course of their overnight investigation, was not what Thomas had done, but what he had not done. He had not reported Charlotte's presence at an unscheduled private gathering to anyone in the household. He had not checked, afterward, whether she had arrived home safely. He had, in fact, continued about his own evening and his own journey home with the comfortable assumption that Princess Charlotte, who was an adult and a capable one, was entirely able to manage her own movements without his involvement or supervision. This assumption was both reasonable and, in the context of royal security protocols, entirely insufficient. The fact that Charlotte had subsequently failed to communicate her whereabouts to the household, and that this had produced a 48-hour disappearance that had mobilized the full resources of the security apparatus, was a consequence of exactly this kind of gap between private social norms and royal protection requirements. Thomas understood this. He said so to his mother, and then he said it again to Sir Edmund Voss in a longer and more formal conversation that afternoon, and the sincerity with which he said it was not in question by anyone who heard him. But sincerity, in the world of institutional security protocols, is not the same as sufficiency. The question was not whether Thomas was a good person who had made a reasonable assumption. The question was whether his position, and the access and trust that came with it, could be maintained alongside the demonstrated gap in his understanding of what that position required, outside the castle walls. The world was still mostly unaware of what had been happening. The journalist with the photographs had not yet moved, which meant that the clock Gerald Hollings had been watching was still running, but had not yet run out. The household's communications team had prepared a statement, the kind of careful, limited statement that says very little while technically saying something, in the event that any information reached the press before the situation was fully resolved. The statement described Princess Charlotte as having spent private time with friends and family, and it said nothing at all about Thomas Parker Bowles, because at the time it was drafted the decision about his title had not yet been confirmed. By the afternoon, it had been. And the question of how that decision would be communicated, both to the household staff, who would hear it first, and eventually to the wider world, became the next significant challenge for the people whose job it was to manage the distance between what happened inside the castle and what the public was permitted to know. The staff at Windsor processed the news in the way that palace staff process all significant institutional events, which is to say with a surface of professional equanimity that covers a substantial undercurrent of private opinion. The opinion was not uniform. Some felt that the decision had been correct and necessary, that the security implications were real and could not be ignored out of sentiment. Others felt a private sympathy for Thomas, who had always been a popular figure in the household, known for his courtesy and his genuine warmth toward the people who worked there. A smaller number felt principally sorry for Camilla, who had not asked for any of this and whose position in the family had always required a particular kind of resilience. The head chef, who had known Thomas for many years and had once said in an unguarded moment that he was the most appreciative member of the extended royal family when it came to food, told the junior kitchen staff only that there had been a decision made at a high level and that it was not anyone's place to have opinions about it. Then he went back to preparing dinner with the absolute focus of a man who believed, quite sincerely, that cooking was one of the few human activities that reliably produced something worth the trouble.